A Lighthouse score plummeted from 94 to 61 after a refactor. Time to interactive doubled from 1.8 to 3.9 seconds. The culprit? A single use client directive on the root layout. The patterns described server components. Use client directive, serialization of date, map, set, big int are stable in Next.js 15 and later. In Next.js 14, map and set serialization is not supported and some server component behaviors may differ. Always check the Next.js version in your package, JSON, and refer to the official docs for version-specific notes. The article mentions dynamic imports, but does not show the next dynamic pattern. Use next dynamic with SSR. False to load heavy client components only when needed, reducing initial bundle size. This is especially useful for components below the fold or triggered by user interaction. A common production mistake is adding use client to the root layout, TSX for a small interactive element, e.g., a sidebar toggle. This forces all children to be client components, ballooning the bundle. Always isolate interactivity into leaf client components and keep layouts as server components. Let's break down server components versus client components in Next.js 16, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. Server components render on the server and send 0 JavaScript to the client. Client components are marked with use client and are included in the JavaScript bundle, hydrated on the client. This is the fundamental architectural decision in Next.js. The server-client boundary is one way. Server components can import client components, but not the reverse. To embed server content in a client wrapper, use the children prop pattern. Here's a server component that fetches data and passes serializable props to a client component. The client component receives plain data and can use hooks like useState. Props passed from server to client must be serializable. Functions are silently dropped, no error, just undefined on the client. Always define event handlers inside client components. Passing a function from a server component to a client component, it will be silently dropped. The onClick will be undefined on the client, and the button won't work. A typical page with 15 server and 3 client components ships about 85 KB. Mark everything, use client, and it jumps to 350-400 KB, adding 2.1 seconds to TTI on 3G. Here's the wrong pattern. Use client at the layout level. Every child becomes client rendered, ballooning the bundle to 350 KB. The correct pattern pushes use client down to only the interactive leaf. The correct pattern: keep the layout as a server component and only mark the interactive sidebar wrapper as use client. The sidebar content remains server rendered, saving hundreds of kilobytes. The children prop pattern lets you embed server rendered content inside a client component wrapper. The server component renders the content, passes it as children, and the client component adds interactivity without importing server code. Here, the FAQ page is a server component that fetches data and renders each answer as children of an accordion client component. The accordion wrapper handles interactivity, while the content stays server rendered. Many third-party libraries can render on the server. If a library doesn't use hooks or browser APIs, use it directly in a server component. Otherwise, create a thin client wrapper that imports the library. Here, Recharts is imported only in a dedicated client wrapper. The server component never imports the library directly, keeping the page bundle small. Context providers require use client, but they should be isolated in their own file. The root layout stays a server component, and children passed to the provider remains server rendered. The theme provider is a client component, but it's isolated. The root layout and all children remain server components, keeping the bundle small. Real pages interleave server and client components. Use the children prop pattern, pass serializable data, and conditionally render client components to save bundle size. Here are 2 patterns: server client, server via children, and conditional client components that only load when needed. Common boundary bugs include silent function drops and hydration mismatches. Always define functions inside client components and avoid browser-only data during render. Here are two bugs: a function prop that's silently dropped, and a hydration mismatch from reading local storage during render. The fixes are to define functions inside client components and use useEffect for browser-only data. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. A single useClient at the root layout forced every child component to be client-rendered. Libraries that could have been server-rendered added 335 KB of unnecessary JavaScript. A single useClient directive on the root layout caused all 47 child components to be client-rendered, adding 240 KB of unnecessary JavaScript. Removing it and using a thin client wrapper for the interactive sidebar toggle fixed the issue. The fix: push useClient down to only the interactive sidebar wrapper. The chart, markdown, and preview components reverted to Nextjs Server components, dropping the bundle from 420 KB to 95 KB. This single line at the root layout caused 335 KB of unnecessary JavaScript. Always audit useClient placement. A single useClient at the root layout forces every component on every page to be client-rendered. This is the most common and costly mistake. Functions passed from server to client are silently dropped. The prop becomes undefined, and the component breaks without any error. To debug client bundle size, run next-build debug to see per-page JavaScript. Use at next bundle analyzer for a visual breakdown. Set CI checks to fail if the bundle exceeds your budget. Let's run through some common interview questions. What is the server-client boundary in Next.js? Server components can import client components but not vice versa. Pass server content as children. How do you pass data from server to client component? Only serializable types, strings, numbers, objects, arrays, date. Functions are silently dropped. What is the children prop pattern? A client component wraps interactivity around server-rendered children passed as props. And a few frequently asked questions. Can a client component import a server component? No. Use the children prop pattern instead. What happens if I pass a function to a client component? It is silently dropped. Define functions inside the client component. How do I reduce client bundle size? Push useClient as low as possible, server render third-party libraries, and use conditional dynamic imports. Let's recap the key takeaways. Server components render to Nextjs. Use client taxes all children, push it down. Use children prop pattern for hybrid components. Audit bundle size with next build debug. Ready to go deeper? Up next, data fetching in Next.js 16. Server components, streaming, and suspense, then styling in Next.js 16. Tailwind CSS modules, and global styles, then image and font optimization in Next.js 16, and loading UI, streaming, and suspense boundaries in Next.js 16. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.